Okay, our next unit here is going to be on syntax. Let me make sure this thing's recording. I just accidentally recorded this part and didn't hit the button. All right, this one looks like it's going. Good. Okay, so for each of these, I'm going to follow a similar structure. First, I'll tell you something sort of very general about what this component of linguistics is about, and then I'll sketch an analysis of some specific phenomena in a specific language or languages. And it's okay if you don't get every single detail. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what kinds of questions these different areas of linguistics are about. And then for each of these, I'm going to try to also draw a high-level generalization about what things look like across languages, right? That will sort of actually give you real research problems and interesting things that people working in these areas of linguistics are concerned with across many different languages. So for semantics, the sort of general principle we looked at there was compositionality. And this is the idea that the meaning of a complex linguistic expression, like a phrase or a sentence, is going to be a function of the meanings of its parts, which might be words or little phrases or morphemes, and the rules for combining those parts. So we're going to have minimal units of meaning, and I'm going to call them words here for simplicity, although again, if you have some linguistics background, you know the real answer is actually morphemes. And we also have rules for combining those minimal units. Syntax is basically about what are those rules like? What are the rules for combining things within a sentence? What are those rules like? So here's one possible answer. Maybe every language just sort of lists which words come after which other words, and you memorize all those word orders. And then the result would be a flat structure, like beads on a necklace. So there's this larger thing called a sentence, and I have to apologize ahead of time. The slides in this section are from a couple different sources, and so you'll see this sentence level called two different things, an inflectional phrase and a tense phrase. You'll see the head of it called an inflection or called a tense. These mean the same thing for our current purposes. It's because I used too many different sources in these slides. Sorry for the confusion. Inflection and tense, for the purposes of this session, are exactly the same thing, and they both basically mean a sentence. Right? And so here's an example of an English sentence. John has read the book. And what does this structure say? Well, there's this large unit, a sentence, and it contains some simple units inside it, and those units come in a particular order. Right? And each one's sort of more or less equal here, but they're just in a different order. So there's a noun, there's an auxiliary verb. This is the thing that's going to be called an inflection or a tense, and it's supposed to be the head of the sentence in the following slides. There's a lexical verb, read, there's the determiner the, and there's the noun book. Right? So there you go. John has read the book. It happens in this order. English speakers know this. Simple theory of sentences. Turns out to be wrong, right? So there's lots of evidence in lots of languages that this flat structure is not how things work. And you'll spend most of the first semester of syntax learning all about that, for all the evidence that things are not flat in this way, but instead some groups of words within a sentence hang together in grammatical generalizations in a way that other groups of words don't. So we call those words that form coherent units to the exclusion of other words. We call those constituents. Each constituent, in addition to being a constituent, has one element in it that is obligatory. Sometimes more than one is obligatory, but there's a special one that's an obligatory part of that constituent, and that gives the entire phrase or the entire constituent some of its properties. And we call that obligatory element that lends its properties to the whole phrase the head of the phrase. So constituents have heads, and then they also have non-head stuff. So I'm going to call all the non-heads here complements. This is a syntactic term. So in English, we have this verb phrase, and it has a head, which is a verb, and it gets some of its properties from that verb. The head is over here at the beginning of the constituent, and it's followed by the complement. The complement is itself a constituent. It's a determiner phrase that's headed by a determiner and is followed by a complement, which is a noun or possibly a noun phrase. The internal structure of these elements, noun phrases or determiner phrases, is a little bit complicated, and I'm going to mostly ignore it here. You'll see some textbooks that say these are determiner phrases with noun phrases inside them. You'll see some textbooks that say these whole things are noun phrases and the determiner is the non-head. We're going to basically ignore this because it's too complicated to get into right here. We're going to be mainly focused on verb phrases and sentences, which are called IPs or TPs, and a larger unit that I'll explain in just a minute. So here's an observation. Word order is different in different languages, right? In general, in English, we're going to see that within a phrase, the head precedes its complement. The head precedes its complement. Here's some sentences in Japanese. Right? Japanese also has verb phrases. Here's one. This is the sentence, John has read the book, or John read the book. And subjects are special, so the subject is still at the beginning of the sentence in Japanese. But the verb phrase here has the direct object book, which is the non-head, followed by the head, read. And there's a larger inflectional or tense phrase here, an IP or a TP, which is headed by this past element. And here, again, the head is last, and the complement comes before it. And this is true no matter how many things you put inside this verb phrase, right? So you can have an indirect object and a direct object and a verb, all inside the verb phrase. But the verb is still last, and the inflectional phrase that contains all of this, the sentence, right, has the inflection or the tense element last. Right? So phrase final. There's a couple more examples here with just more and more elaborate verb phrases and inflectional phrases and embedded clauses. I'm not going to go through every word of these. The embedded clause one is particularly important here because it's even bigger than a sentence. Normally, in many languages, embedded clauses like John is reading the book are introduced by a special functional element. In English, it's the word that. And this is referred to as a complementizer. And it's this whole thing, that John is reading the book, is referred to as a complementizer phrase. I guess the idea there is that it takes a whole sentence and turns it into a complement of this verb thinks. Right? That's why it's called a complementizer. This is a complementizer phrase. In English, just as in the tense phrase, is reading the book, head first, verb phrase next, complementizer phrase is also head initial. That, head of the complementizer phrase, is first. John is reading the book is the complement. That's final. Japanese, again, exact opposite. Right? So here is the main clause verb, think, right? And its tense element, again, follows it. This introduces the complement that John read a book. And that complement is a complementizer phrase headed by this complementizer to, that. Right? And again, this head of the complementizer phrase is final. Its complement precedes it. Right? So exact opposite of English. So many things differ between Japanese and English, obviously. But within the syntax, one big thing going on here is that it looks like the relative order of heads and complements is just different. So there's lots of surface differences in here, but a lot of them seem to reduce to this one parameter. In languages like English, the head of a phrase systematically precedes its complement, which here is referred to as a sister. It's the element that it merges in the syntax with. Head, non-head, right? Complement. That, Mary will read books. Within the tense phrase, we think that this modal will is the tense or the inflectional element. And so head, complement, verb phrase. Within the verb phrase, read books, verb, head, right? And then complement, books. So here is a constituency chart of what this English sentence might look like. And subjects work differently. They have a little bit more internal structure to them in both Japanese and English. There's good explanation for this. We're going to skip it for now, so just ignore the subjects. We want to be focused here again on the sentences. Here, these are called IPs. You'll also see them called TPs later in these slides. Again, sorry for the confusion. It's either an inflectional phrase or a tense phrase. It's headed by either an inflectional element or a tense element. They basically mean the same thing. Right? So we're going to be focused on the IPs. the VPs and the CPs here in particular, right? In English, we have this big IP. It's headed by an inflectional element, is, and that element is followed by its complement, which is a verb phrase. Within that verb phrase, we have a head, thinking, and that's followed by a complement, which here is a CP, a complementizer phrase, this entire embedded clause. Within that complementizer phrase, there's a head element, the complementizer that, and it's followed by its complement, the IP or the sentence or the TP. John is reading the book. You go down into this lower clause, this lower sentence, and you find the exact same thing. Head, complement, head, complement, and so on and so forth. So English is, broadly speaking, a head initial language. There might be an exception or two. In head final languages, on the other hand, the head of a phrase systematically follows its complement, or the element that it merges with in the syntax. So here, you're going to find the non-head first and the head last. This is basically how Japanese works, again, ignoring subjects. That's why this is over in parentheses over here. Right? So verb phrase, head, read, complement, books. Complement precedes the head, head final. Inflectional phrase or tense phrase, here's the inflection or tense element, will, follows its complement. Books read will. Right? Complementizer phrase, complementizer is final. Right? It follows the complement. Books read will, that. Right? So in the end, this is going to look awfully different from English word order. The word order in Japanese, of course, substituting English words, is going to look like this. Again, there's the subject that is sort of different, Sue. Right? And this is saying Sue believes that Mary will read books. The word order here is going to be something like Sue, Mary books read will that believes. Right? So almost the exact opposite of the English word order. Here is what a Japanese sentence might look like, and here the actual transliterations of the Japanese words are given. Here it's the exact same thing, but I've just given you the translations of those words. And here we're still looking at IPs as sentences. It's going to switch to TP in a minute. Sorry about that. But again, subjects are just sort of different. They're hanging out here on the side. We're going to skip that. But focusing on the IPs and VPs and CPs, right? We already saw this in English. The head seems to precede its complement, exact opposite in Japanese. In this inflectional phrase or projection, we get inflection last, the head, this auxiliary verb. Complement, the verb phrase, precedes it. Within that verb phrase, the head is last, the verb thinking. In its complement, its non-head, this CP precedes it. Within that CP, the head is last, the complement precedes it, and so on and so forth down the tree here. So that's kind of neat. It looks like there's this difference between English and Japanese that causes very complicated word order patterns on the surface, but underlyingly, it looks like one of the main things going on is just this pretty simple parameter. Do heads follow their complements or do they precede their complements? Right? Subjects, again, are going to work differently. We put that aside. Here's a question. Can we have languages that aren't either uniformly head initial or head final? And the answer is yes. There are many languages, probably most languages, that are not entirely head initial or entirely head final, but they mix different kinds of head initial and head final phrases. So let me give you a couple examples. These ones are both Germanic. That's because I happen to have these data at hand. But you can find versions of these patterns in many other language families as well. Here's German. And I apologize for my bad German pronunciation. I'm going to do my best here. Here is, in German, we're going to limit our attention to embedded clauses, these CPs. And there's a good reason for that. It's because main clauses in German work totally different than embedded clauses in a way that is super interesting and that I would love to teach you about, but I don't have time in this particular lecture. So we're going to focus on the embedded clauses instead. The main clauses in German are also well formed, but they obey a totally different generalization. So here's embedded clauses in German. We're going to eventually build an embedded clause that Marie will read the book. And so this could be embedded under I think that Marie will read the book or something like that. So here is the lowest verb phrase, and we have the verb read, lesen, preceded by its complement, das Buch, the book. Right? So here is read the book, das Buch lesen. Head final, verbs last. The IP here, again, the inflectional phrase or the sentence, is headed by this element will, wird, and that element is last. It's preceded by its complement, head final. Right? Verb phrase, inflection. Das Buch lesen wird. Embed this under a complementizer, that Marie will read the book. Right? Uh-oh, these two are head final, but it looks like the complementizer phrase is head initial. Right? So here's the head, das, followed by the IP or TP or sentence, Marie will read the book. That's weird. Das Marie das Buch lesen wird. So here's a mixed language. We have head final VP, head final IP or TP, but head initial CP. Here's another example. A related language, Afrikaans. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. I have no idea how Afrikaans is pronounced. This one we're going to, again, looking at embedded phrases, because in Germanic you often get differences between embedded and main clauses. Pretty neat topic. We're going to skip it here. So just focusing on embedded clauses again. Again, you can think about this as, I think that she often played Chopin. That's the big embedded clause we're eventually going to generate. And just like German, that embedded verb phrase, head final. So complement Chopin, followed by the verb played. Probably something like gespielt, but I have no idea how that's pronounced. The IP here. Oh, this is different from German. It looks like the IP, headed by this auxiliary verb has. And sorry, here again, mixing IP and TP terminology. Confusing. I meant to fix this. I didn't quite get to it. But anyway, here, head is initial. Verb phrase that follows it is head final. Interesting. And you embed it under the complementizer that, dot. Again, head initial. So head initial, embedded TP or IP or sentence is head initial as well, but the verb phrase embedded inside that is head final. So this is similar to German, but it works a little bit differently at the IP or TP or sentence level. Here's two more examples of some mixed languages. Oh, sorry, this is the ones we just did. Head final, verb phrase, and TP or IP. Head initial, CP. Here's Afrikaans, head final VP, head initial TP or IP, and head initial CP. Here's two other patterns that you can imagine. Literary Martian. This one has a head initial verb phrase, read books. Head initial TP or IP, will read books, just like English so far. But a head final CP, not like English, will read books that. I think Mary will read books that. Here's another pattern, Old High Venusian. And this one, like English, will have a head initial verb phrase, read books. But here we'll have a head final IP or TP, read books will, and a head final CP, read books will that. So these are two patterns you can imagine. I've given them these silly names from Mars and from Venus. Why have I done that? Well, there don't seem to be any languages that work like this. We have mixed languages like German and Afrikaans, but not mixed languages like Literary Martian or Old High Venusian. Well, that's a little bit weird. Why do things work that way? Well, I can't give you all the explanation today, but I will tell you that this is an active research topic in syntax, and it goes under the name of the final over final constraint, and it's a possible linguistic universal. So Anders Holmberg and his colleagues have proposed that this might be a universal constraint in syntax of human languages. Of course, that is not settled science. People agree and disagree with that. They'll debate over it, but this is the kind of question that gets debated in syntax. So here's their statement of this constraint. Within a single clause, and we'll ignore the noun phrase for now, if a phrase is head initial, the phrase that immediately contains it must also be head initial. Right? So this is why the Martian and Venusian examples don't work, because we have head initial phrases here, verb phrase and sentence or inflectional phrase, but the phrase that contains this one within the clause is going to be head final. So that violates the final over final constraint. Similarly here, head initial verb phrase, but it's contained within the clause within a head final IP or TP. So that violates the final over final constraint. That said, so that's a constraint on the distribution of head complement orders apparently across languages. If a phrase is head final, on the other hand, then the syntax doesn't care. That can be inside a head final phrase, as we saw in Japanese, or it can be inside a head initial one, as we saw in German and Afrikaans, right? So head final verb phrase contained inside a head final inflectional phrase or tense phrase. But both these head final phrases contained within a head initial complementizer phrase. No problem. The final constraint doesn't say anything about what has to contain head final phrases. Similarly, in Afrikaans, head final verb phrase, perfectly fine to be contained within a head initial TP or IP. It's only the opposite pattern in these two languages that appears to be marked across languages, that seems to be unavailable. So that's a possible syntactic universal, and there's various languages that look like they might pose a problem for it, and so people argue back and forth about how those possible counterexamples actually work, but this is the kind of thing that syntax is about.